jump in and ask questions. All right, let's see if I can share this. All right, can everyone see that presentation?
Yep.
Awesome. Okay. So this is kind of the format of what I'll go through today. So the purpose of an interview, the different types, how to prepare, a method for answering questions effectively, what to wear, and then some just general tips and follow-up. So really what I like to start with the purpose is just kind of reminding everyone that ideally your interview should be a two-way street. So I know a lot of you are, well, a lot of us are, anytime we're interviewing, obviously we want that company to like us. And so a lot of times it can feel like we're the only ones being interviewed, and there's a lot of stress that comes with that and those anxious thoughts and feelings, and that's totally normal. What we sometimes forget is that we're also interviewing that company, right? So how they treat us during the interview, the types of questions they ask, the way they respond to our questions, all of those are going to be really good information points for us to determine, is this someone we would want to work for in the future? So you can do that by just asking questions. You can do that by observing throughout the interview, all sorts of ways to kind of get a check or a feel for what is this company like and will they mesh with you. Does anybody have any thoughts on making an interview feel more like a two-way street?
I recently had an interview and they asked me like what I thought I could do to change the position to make it better fit me and like what I had learned, because they said they were interviewing a lot of different people from different schools, but that Cal Poly had like a unique learning system, like with the hands-on labs and stuff. And so they asked like what I would change to the job description, which is kind of a hard question, but it makes you think about if the job is actually a good fit for you. If you really needed to change a lot, it's probably not a good fit.
Totally. Yeah, thanks for that insight. It's also, if they are asking that question, it's kind of a cool indicator that they're willing to give you that autonomy to change the position potentially. So just by that question, you can kind of gather that insight. Thanks, Olivia. Any other thoughts? How many of you feel like the interviews you've had have been two-way streets? Kind of. How many of you feel like it's just been strictly one way? Yeah, a little bit. It can be challenging, and I think this might be something that comes the more interviews that you have, because it's not a natural thing to feel super like you have that power to interview them. But just know, as you're going through it, any information you gather should be kind of taken in and then put through your filter of, is this someone I would want to work for? All right, let's see. So different types of interviews. We'll go through these kind of one by one. How many of you have had a phone or a Skype interview? Nice. See a couple hands. Those might be more common now in the near future. What are some, let's start with pros. What are some pros of a phone or a Skype interview?
I've never had one, but I feel like I would get less nervous with no like face-to-face contact, really.
Yeah, I feel like it feels like you have more time to answer questions when it's over the phone rather than face-to-face.
Awesome. More time and a little bit less pressure or less nerves. What might be some cons or challenges?
So we're going to be interviewing a tenure track faculty position starting next week in our department. And we're going to have 4 candidates coming, and they're going to be doing 11 hours of Zoom meetings. and not all at once, of course. But anyway, I feel like on the Zoom interviews that I've done with other faculty who have been applying for jobs, it's sort of challenging sometimes to really see how they are in a social setting, and to pick up on kind of, well, the nonverbal cues are pretty difficult to pick up on when you have a Zoom meeting with someone, just because of the fact that sometimes where the webcam is situated on the computer screen, it just makes it awkward for the person to be looking at you. So sometimes their eyes are sort of diverted from how they would be if you were carrying on a normal conversation, or it could be that they're awkward just in general, and so they wouldn't be looking at you if they were in person, but you don't know that, right? In a kind of a Zoom or a Skype interview setting. So those are going to be some challenging things to pick up on as we go through this process.
Totally. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
I feel like it also tends to feel really impersonal when you're not like in the room with them. Like it just feels like you're kind of just in this other place, not really like engaged in, I mean, I don't want to say not engaged, but kind of like you're just not like in the room with them, not able, like Dr. Paul was saying, like not able to read visual cues or get all their characteristics down just by looking at them and based off where the webcam is situated. But it just feels like, I don't know, when you do things over technology, it just doesn't feel like as much of a genuine experience sometimes.
Totally. And I think something I've realized even the past couple of weeks of being remote is just how much being in the same physical space actually does add to that community. So that's been interesting. And another thing that might come into play is you're not seeing the office, you're not all experiencing that same place. I think what you were alluding to. Yeah. So it can be really challenging to convey your personality through an interview that's phone or Skype. And it can sometimes, another challenge that we hear, and maybe not so much anymore, is just the technology and how a lot of times, it's going to glitch out, or they can't hear you very well, or you're in a spot with, bad internet. I forgot the word that you used, but you don't have the best connection, right? And so all of that can kind of add to the stress of your interview as well. And so you really want to be as, I guess, animated as possible so that they're not relying on those nonverbal cues, and you can actually express whatever you're trying to express through those cues. And so that does take a little bit of practice to be able to articulate, oh yeah, I agree with that, or definitely I'm so on board with that. Those types of things that you might not say normally, but can help kind of fill the void of not having those nonverbals. So thanks for those thoughts. All right. The next type of interview would be a one-on-one interview. So you and one other person, as opposed to a panel interview or a group interview. So how many of you have had a one-on-one individual interview with somebody else? Nice. Few of you. Awesome. Sweet. What about a panel interview? Few of you. Nice. I'm scrolling through your squares over here. What about a group interview? Wow, more than I would expect. All right. Whoops. Does anybody want to comment on any of those types of interviews? Just thoughts on those?
To me, the group interview seems like the worst one.
Yes, I agree.
Not for a long time have I experienced an interview like that. And certainly not since I finished graduate school, but I know that probably many of you have gone through a group interview, so feel free to jump in and share something about that, or a panel. But groups seem like they're very challenging.
Did a group interview, and it was kind of interesting because they would always ask the same question, but it was tough because if someone answered for you and they went around the circle, the person who's last would have to kind of like, it was just tough to answer the question because someone has already answered it, and probably said what you wanted to say.
Totally.
So it just seems redundant if you add on to it.
Right. It adds that extra pressure of saying something new. Awesome. Yeah, so group interviews, I agree, I think are also the worst, at least as an interviewee. And I've heard different ways, right? Sometimes they allow everyone to answer the same question, kind of one after another. Other times I've heard of group interviews where they just ask the question and they kind of let whoever can answer in the first few minutes and then they move on. And so it's kind of even more pressure to like say something really quickly right away. And again, that's where that two-way street comes in, right? If they, even just those two differences, you can start to tell a little bit about that company, right? If they're not letting each individual answer, are they really looking for someone, or do they value that competition, or do they value someone who's going to kind of speak up and jump in? And so they can kind of gauge that, but at the same time, you can assess whether or not you want to work for someone who's not going to give voice to everyone in the group. With groups, what I usually try to say is try your best not to compare yourself to other people's answers, and stick with the answer you were going to go with. So even if it's the same as someone else's, I recommend acknowledging that and then describe that you were going to say the same thing. Maybe you add a little bit of context to make it more personal, but try to stick with your own answers. Really what an interview is for is to gauge whether or not you're going to be a good fit. And if you're kind of tailoring or changing your answers based on someone else's, it's going to be hard for them to know authentically if you were going to be a good fit. So super challenging in a group environment. Hopefully you don't have to do many more of those in your future. And then individual, some of the pros with that is you get really individual feedback, right? So you're talking with one person, you can really gauge, okay, are we jiving? Are my answers making sense? Are they not? You can have more of that interpersonal interaction. And a lot of times that can be comforting to an extent. The challenge with that is you're only meeting one person, right? So you're not getting as broad of an introduction to the rest of the people at the company. And so that can be challenging to try to make a decision if that's the only interview you have, trying to make a decision just based on that one meeting. And so then the opposite is true with a panel. You might feel a little bit less interpersonal connection, but you can at least get a little bit better feel for multiple people in the company, ideally at multiple different positions. So you can kind of gauge what the team is like and how they might work together. Some tricks with the panel. One thing that can be challenging is maintaining eye contact with all of the panelists. There's a tendency to want to just answer the question to the person who just asked you that question, but try your best to engage everyone throughout the interview. And then there's also a tendency to want to answer the question to whoever's kind of nodding or being most reassuring, right? And so kind of remember to shift your gaze kind of evenly throughout the interview. Questions about any of those three? All right. So the next lunch or dinner, has anybody gotten to experience this? It's Doctor of Hell. Awesome.
Many times.
Yes. Those are the good ones, right?
Yeah, usually, well, when we interview people for a faculty position in our department, it's kind of a combination of panel and lunch, dinner, or meal, because usually the search committee is like 4 people. And so they're at the meal with the person who's interviewing for the job. And usually it's business, and it's also sort of just seeing what it's like to hang out with the other person. In a faculty position at Cal Poly, and I know you're familiar with this, Krista, though, there's certain things that we can't ask about, which makes it sort of challenging sometimes. So you can't ask a lot of personal questions about if they have a family or children, or you can ask about hobbies kind of in general, but you can't get too personal on some things.
Right. And I wonder how common that is across industries. I definitely know, at Cal Poly, we have a lot of those, I don't know if rules is the right way to say it, but parameters to follow. And I think it's pretty common across the board that, certain topics are going to be avoided, but it is more of that casual setting to get to know somebody on a more personal level. And so kind of like Dr. Appel alluded to, right, more often than not, more than one of these types is going to be involved in the interview process. And so you might start with a phone interview until you get invited on site, and then maybe you kind of go into a panel and then to lunch, or maybe you have individual and then dinner. So you can expect kind of a blend of each of these types, which is exciting and also nerve-wracking. So just know with each, there's going to be pros and cons and different ways to kind of approach each type of interview. Okay, so before you go into the interview, as soon as you get that invite, really that first step that you want to do is do some research. So you really want to start researching the company, which hopefully you've done a little bit of this before the application, right? Because you've tailored your resume and your cover letter. So you know a little bit of this, but now you want to dive deeper because you want to go into that interview prepared. So check out their values, their mission, reread your job description, make sure you're pretty clear on what it is they're expecting you to do, especially in the context of their company and who they work with, things like that. If there are any alumni you can connect with, or if there's anything as far as inside scoop goes that you can connect with someone and just ask, hey, I have an interview coming up in the next couple of weeks. Is there anything I should know, anything I should mention or look into beforehand? If you have that network, definitely use it. Other tips as you're doing this research: one, tie it into your experience, right? So know how you can contribute to their success based on what you're finding. So through your research, if you're recognizing like, oh, I did this project that's super related, I didn't even talk about that on my resume, right? Know that you're going to bring that up. Or even if you did talk about it on your resume, practice articulating it in a way that you're going to describe to them, I know what you do, and also I want to connect it to what I have done in the past. And then know why you are specifically interested in working for their organization. Bringing someone on or hiring someone is a huge investment in a company's time and money. And so they want to know that you're actually interested in working for them, right? And so one of the best ways to kind of make them feel good about it or convince them I'm going to be a good employee, I'm going to be worth your time and money, is in the interview to describe specifically what you're interested in contributing to their organization. Any thoughts on that research piece? Looking good. All right. So once you research the company in general, the next thing you can do is look specifically at the job description and think, okay, if this is what they're asking for, what might a question be based on that job description, and then come up with the experience that you want to relate it to. And not only, I guess preparing for interviews is always hard because you want to prepare as much as you can and you want to practice answering questions, but you also have to be prepared for questions to be slightly different than what you thought they would be, or maybe a question that you had no idea was going to be asked. So it's this weird blend of trying to prepare as much as you can while also recognizing that you're never going to go into an interview knowing exactly what's going to happen. But this can really help just determine, what types of things might they ask in the interview. And so here's a couple of examples. Responsibilities, skills, and qualifications. So if the responsibilities on the job description say something like collaborate with internal stakeholders and external clients to compile data and compliance paths for green building, a question might be, tell me about a time you worked in a team to produce a final project. What challenges did you encounter and how did you handle them? Right. So if the main word is collaborate, then they're likely going to ask about your collaboration style. Right. Same thing. If some of the qualifications are organizational, detail-oriented, time management, they might ask you about your organizational skills or how you've managed various projects or priorities. So you can be more prepared simply by just diving into that job description. Other ways to kind of do some research is Glassdoor.com. Has anybody used that or heard of that? Sweet. So Glassdoor has previous interview questions. So people who have interviewed with companies can go on there and add the interview questions that company asked them. So you can kind of get some insight into what they might ask. Recognize that just because a company has asked it in the past, by no means means they're going to ask it for sure in the future, but can just kind of help gauge what types of questions to expect. All right. So you're going to do what you can.
What was the name of that website?
It's Glassdoor, and I believe it's .com, not .org.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Handshake also has that interview question feature. So if you do find a job on Handshake, go check out that company and see if there's any interview answers there. It's definitely less utilized than Glassdoor, but it's on there and typically more recent. So check that out too. All right, so you're going to do what you can to see what questions they might ask, and then you're going to connect it to your experience. And then this is that method of answering questions that we recommend. So the purpose of a behavioral interview question, or one that starts with tell me about a time when, or can you describe an experience that, anything that's wanting you to kind of reflect back or share a story of something, this is when we would recommend utilizing that method. And really, questions like that, the purpose are to help that employer see, okay, if you say you're organized, tell us about a time that you manage multiple priorities, because likely that's something you're going to be doing in the job, and your past behavior is going to help predict your future behavior or your future performance. So they want to know concrete examples. So the method that we recommend using to answer those questions is the CAR method. So you want to start out your answer describing the challenge or giving them some context. Okay, so that's going to be about 20 to 30% of your answer. And then you want to spend the bulk of your answer, about 50%, talking about the action that you took, right? So if it is, how did you manage multiple priorities, you want to spend the bulk of your answer describing what were your management techniques. And then the last 20 or 30% is going to be what was the result of those management techniques, or how does it relate to this position specifically? And so once you kind of build it all together, it should really be this story that's ending with a direct correlation to what it is they're asking for. And so a couple of things. A lot of times we get lost in the context. We start telling the story and we just start describing a bunch of things that maybe don't need to be in that answer. But that's the easy part, right? Because we recall it, it happened to us, and we want to share that whole context. But then what we often do is kind of gloss over the action that we took. And so that part is reduced to a really small amount of our question, because that's the piece that requires us to really hone in on what did we do, or what can you really take ownership of? And that's not always natural for us to do. And then that relevance piece can be really easy to leave out, but is really crucial and can help make your answer so much stronger if you're doing that relating for the employer. So you're not like requiring the employer to do it, right? You're not just telling them a story and then hoping they see the connection. You're actually drawing the connection for them. So as you kind of go through practicing interview questions, one thing I like to relate it to is like when you're getting back from a trip and someone asks, how was your trip? The first person you tell, you're going to include a ton of different details that could be left out. You might forget a detail and then have to go back and include it later, right? You just got back from the trip. There's no reason why you don't remember, but you just haven't told the story yet. And so it takes some fine tuning. By the 6th or 7th person who asks how your trip was, you have this one beautiful, cohesive story. You know what you're going to include, you know what you're going to leave out, and it just flows a lot better. So the first thing is, the more you practice your interview questions, the easier it's going to be to actually answer them in the interview, even if the question is slightly different. Just understanding some of those stories or experiences can really help. And then the next is trying to really focus on this method and see where you might be leaving something out, or where you might be spending too much time. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions?
I have a thought.
Yes, please.
So I've been in this class, I've been doing mock interviews for a long time. And I think I just want to sort of convey that you probably have a lot of different experiences that you can come up with and talk about. And I want to encourage you to think about some interesting ones that have a good story associated with them. So like, as an example, and this, I'm going to give you an example of an interview that I did with a student, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago, but I still remember it because the story was so good. And it was only 30% of the whole, conversation that we had surrounding it. But the question was, tell me about a time when you responded to a valid criticism by a supervisor. And so the student said, I had a summer internship where I was working for the U.S. Forest Service, and I had the habit of paying attention to the GPS unit to find the locations that I was supposed to get to do some surveys, and not really focusing on my surroundings. And when I had been out in the field with my boss, they had noticed that and told me that, you need to look up because you're in the woods. You don't know what's around you. You have to pay attention to it. And so she didn't really take that to heart. And she ended up walking down a trail by herself one time, looking at her GPS, and she sensed something, and she looked up, and in front of her, about 50 feet, was a brown bear, just sort of staring at her. And so she then went on to talk about the actions that she took to remedy that problem, and then what the result and the relevance of that action was, being better safety for her. But I still remember that story because it was so good, right? So as you're thinking about preparing for an interview, think about, right, of all the stories that you have, think about some good ones, right? Because those are the kind of things that help people remember who you are and set you apart when they're trying to make a decision.
Awesome. Thank you. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I have a question. How long, like, should your answer be? Like, how much time? Yeah.
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 That's a really good question. It's difficult because it depends on a lot of variables. First of all, like how in depth the question is, but also like how long do you have for the interview? A lot of times they'll start out with saying, we have this many questions for you. We have 30 minutes for the interview. And if you have any questions at the end, we'll save some time for that, right? So you can kind of start getting a feel for how much time you might have per question type of thing. But really, once you start practicing and speaking it out, they don't usually last longer than, I would say, like a minute or two.
Right.
And that, it sounds kind of short, I think, when I say it, but then when you're talking for 2 minutes straight, you kind of recognize that it might be longer. But there's no real hard and fast, don't go over this time limit. Good question. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. All right. And then just to add on, Dr. Appel made me think of something as well. It's a lot of times I work with students and, they're like, I just don't have an example of this, or I don't really know what I would say if they asked me X, Y, and Z. Your examples don't have to be exactly what it is they're looking for, right? So if the student Dr. Appel was interviewing wasn't ever going to be in the woods using GPS, but she was still able to convey how she responded to criticism, right? That's a really amazing story that outside of the context has nothing to do with, I don't know what you were hiring for, but it might not have anything to do with that. And so keep that in mind too. I hear once we kind of take that pressure to have this like perfect, exactly, tell me about a time you've done exactly what we want you to do in this role. If you take that out of the picture and just think, what is the skill that they're trying to gauge, right? Or what is the main thing that they want to know? It can be easier to start brainstorming some of those creative or more memorable examples. Awesome. Okay. So these are kind of the three main that I like to make you work through. In the past, I had asked you to look at the job description you were tailoring your resume and cover letter to and trying to come up with a question. Trying to think of like the best way to do this via Zoom.
So we could do it in breakout groups, breakout rooms. Want to try that?
Yeah, let's try that.
Okay. Let's do it.
Whoops. Don't look. Okay. So I guess we'll have breakout room, just maybe 3 breakout rooms.
Yeah, we could do that. That would be like 8 people or so in each room. You want to be smaller than that? Maybe like 6 rooms with like 4-ish or so people, or we could do more.
Yeah, let's do 6 with about 4 people. That'd be perfect.
All right, so I never tried this before, but I think it works pretty easily. You are all going to be broken into a room sort of randomly, and there will be about 4 of you per room, and then we'll give you how much time, Krista? Like 5 minutes or something?
Yeah, maybe 5 minutes.
Yeah, and we'll call you back after about that time, or we'll check in and see how you're doing. Do any of you have any questions?
Yeah, I have a question. What exactly are we doing in these breakout groups?
That's a great question.
That is a great question. in your groups, let's do if groups, will they get group numbers? I think it'll give you a number. So if it gives you a number, let's do groups 1 and 2. With your group, practice answering, tell me about a time you worked in a team environment and encountered conflict. Groups 3 and 4, tell me about yourself. And again, just practice answering in your group, or at least talk in your group about what you might say or what your thoughts are on that question. And then 5 and 6, what is your greatest weakness? And if you don't get numbers, or if that's too confusing, then just practice whichever question you remember and talk about that with your group.
And just to reiterate that, I really encourage you to take this opportunity to practice, right? Because it's difficult to find time to practice with other people who are going to give you feedback. And the people who you're in your breakout room with, listen carefully and give some good feedback, because that's going to be helpful to the people that you're in your room with, to be prepared for when they actually do an interview. And here's another question too that almost every interview that I've been part of has asked, and that is, why do you want this job?
Mm-hmm.
So that's another one that you could consider answering if you want to. Okay, thanks for asking that question, Patrick. Is there any other questions before I divide you out? Okay, have a great time.
Is everyone back? Looks like it. So how did that go? Groups 1 or 2, or anybody that talked about, tell me about a time you worked in a team environment and encountered conflict. How was that question?
So my big breakout room did that, and everyone's answers were really good. A lot of the things that we talked about were like creative problem thinking, or like just talking it out with that person. Mm-hmm. So I thought those were both just really good ideas on like easy fixes to situations like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Awesome. Did anything stick out as in your team's examples as something that was really compelling or you hadn't thought about?
Not really.
That's all right. I feel like my Zoom pauses are way longer than my in-person pauses would be, but that's okay. So for this question, the CAR method definitely comes into play, right? And I loved hearing those specific actions of like talking it out with your team or problem solving with your team. Something I like to highlight with this one in particular is it can be really easy to lose ownership. Right. And so to just say, so we just talked it out and we figured it out and we got the group project turned in on time. But then you may have lost that ownership of, well, what did you actually do to help the conflict? right? Were you the one that brought all the group together? Were you the one that asked the question that kind of lit up the group with like, oh, that might be what's going on? So focus in on every question, but this is one where it gets lost commonly, is what did you do? And take that ownership and use those I statements in your action responses. All right, any other thoughts, even those groups who didn't have this question, thoughts or questions on this question? All right. How about, let's see, what's the second one? Tell me about yourself. The groups who had that one, what kinds of things came up?
We found it kind of difficult to answer the question because it's like so broad. But we like figured like based on the interview you're doing, so we kind of decided to do like what we turned in for our resume and cover letter.
Awesome.
And spoke about that. So just knowing what the interview is going to be about, you can kind of cater your answer to, like if you're applying to do, someone said in our group, if we're doing like field work, you can mention that you like being outside or doing stuff like that. But if you're like in an office, like you can mention that you're good at typing on a computer or enjoy doing computer stuff. But yeah.
Totally.
Yeah, our group also had a hard time answering that question. But yeah, I was thinking same with that idea that like when I was interviewed for summer camp position, it was easy to just talk about how like some of my hobbies included going outdoors or hiking, like growing plants, stuff like that. So like, yeah, just catering your answer towards the job and the job description for that question.
Mm-hmm. I love it. Yeah, I love to hear that you're already tailoring your answers and taking those job descriptions. That's amazing. And this question is a tough one because it is broad and general. And so it's hard to really even when you do try to cater it to that specific job, you still don't really know exactly what they're looking for. And so really it's kind of up to you on what do you want to share. It's okay to get a little bit personal with this question. And by that, I mean like to share things outside of your professional experience. So if it is hobbies, like you like being outside, or, you know, you grew up with younger siblings, so you really like working with kids or whatever it is, right? It's okay to pull in those pieces of your personal self in this question. Yeah. Awesome. Any other thoughts, or people who weren't in that group have questions? All right. This is a good one to practice because it can be really easy to just ramble on. And as you're in the interview, you want to start including more and more, or it can be really easy to just say, oh, well, I'm a third-year environmental earth and soil science major at Cal Poly, and I'm from Utah, and right. So, and then it gets really short and that's all you say. So it can be a really good one to practice. All right. What about your greatest weakness?
In my breakout session, I just want to ask your opinion on if it's too cliche to nowadays say like that your greatest weakness is that you work too hard, or if you do that kind of, is it too cliche nowadays, or can you still use that? And
so yeah, that's a good question, and that came up in the breakout room I was in too. Is like, are you supposed to share a weakness that is really you're sharing a strength, right? And my response to that is always be genuine, right? So if you really are a perfectionist, it's okay to share that as your weakness, but then talk about how that perfectionism has actually gotten in the way of your work before. And so be real with that weakness, and don't just say it because it sounds good or it's really easy to see the positive side of that. And then what's really important is that result piece of the CAR method is really wrapping up with, what do you do to make sure that your perfectionism doesn't stop you from turning assignments in on time or supporting the team with the big picture projects or whatever. So really it's that action result combination of wanting to tell the employer, what are you doing to actually help mitigate that weakness so it's not impacting your work. But you definitely want to share a real weakness, because employers for sure know when you're just sharing one that sounds good. Thanks for asking that. Other thoughts on this one? Does that make sense? Sharing that genuine weakness? Okay. Yeah. Awesome. What about why do you want this position? Did anybody talk about that question? Any thoughts or questions on that position? Because it is a very common one. Or why do you want to work for us, or something along those lines?
Would it be smart to say like you want the position just to kind of gain experience, or?
Yeah, good question. So I would say, instead of saying like what you would gain from the position, say more about what is interesting to you about that company, or what do you hope to contribute to the company through that position. Definitely don't say like you just need a job. That's, even though that might be what you're feeling, make it more personalized to them, right? And this is where that research comes into play. I saw that you do this. It's totally okay to go into, I would love to gain exposure to this industry, or I'm really interested in this project that you're working on, and I would be very excited to have that experience. So it's okay to kind of say that you want to gain that experience. But I would just personalize it to that company in that position, and B, still kind of make it more about like them and how you would contribute.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Liam. Awesome. Dr. Pell, any other thoughts?
Yeah, like for that last one, when we interview people, I'm always looking for people to be enthusiastic, for one, and I think that should carry on through the entire interview anyway. But what I'm hoping that they would say is, one, why do they want the specific position? So what are the attributes about it that are attractive to them and how they're a good fit for it? And then two, why do they want to work for the entity they're applying to? So in that part of the response, they should have done some research about the company, or about, some of the attributes that the company has that someone finds very attractive. And I feel like that ties in nicely to the first paragraph of a cover letter, right? Because in the first paragraph of the cover letter, you should have done some research about the company and responded to sort of that without being asked it.
Absolutely. Awesome. And that enthusiasm is something we will touch on just in the general tips, because that is something that we have heard employers say after we survey a lot of the employers that come to the career fair, like, what did you think about the students? How can we coach them more? And time after time, they say they have such amazing experience. The learn by doing is amazing. But something they always say that our students need more of is enthusiasm. And so from someone who works closely with students individually, my first perspective on that is, well, they're just really nervous and they have a lot going on, right? But it's so important to convey to that employer that you would be really excited to work for them and to demonstrate that enthusiasm. And so having or filtering that research into your answers and making it more specific to them really does help, and can go a really long way. So thank you for adding that. All right. So those are some of the common questions. Like Dr. Appel mentioned, it's really hard to get that experience practicing answering those questions. So whenever you can, do a little practice interview. We'll go over some tools at the end, but even the mock interviews that you'll do are super beneficial for that. Okay. So as far as professional dress goes, this really varies by industry. And so I feel a little conflicted about this slide every time. But really what you want to do is kind of understand what someone in that company might wear on a typical day, and then dress for a really nice day on that job. And at the end of the day, it's not going to hurt to overdress. If you're substantially overdressed, it might, look a little bit funny, but if you're just a little bit overdressed, really that is another way to show enthusiasm. And so always clean and wrinkle-free, well-fitted are kind of my 3 go-tos, and then hopefully comfortable, or as comfortable as you can be in professional attire. You don't want to wear things that you would never normally wear, and so you're kind of constantly, tugging at your tie or pulling down your skirt or whatever it is. Interviews are already uncomfortable, so hopefully your clothes don't make it worse. Questions or thoughts?
I just have something for the clothing. Sometimes companies might give you a tour, and especially being in the science world, being lab safe. I recently got toured, and they told me that I had to wear pants. So just keeping that in mind, if they might show you around, that you should be maybe save the dress or the skirt for something else. But.
Thanks, Livia. And did they tell you that when they were scheduling the interview with you?
Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. And ideally that's what they do. If you have any questions, or if you kind of have this feeling well, maybe they'll show me a tour, but they didn't say wear pants or wear lab appropriate attire, it's always okay to contact them and ask, is there anything I should be prepared for? Should I wear lab appropriate attire, or are we going into the field? Should I wear my boots? Totally okay to ask what's the appropriate attire for this interview. Thank you for sharing that. So just some final tips. Try to arrive 10 to 15 minutes early. Meet the interviewers with a firm handshake and a friendly smile. Or if it's via phone or Skype, friendly smile. Turn off and put away your cell phone. Bring Padfolio to carry your resume or other materials. I usually like to say, take your research with you, right? So bring those resumes, bring that folder, and then put any notes that you took to prepare for the resume in that Padfolio as well. 90% of the time you won't ever look at it. It's just kind of nice to know that if you do freeze up, or if you totally forget, you can always open it up and say, I actually prepared for this question. Let me see what I wrote down. And you can do that if you need to. But more often than not, it's just kind of that safety feeling of you have that if you need it. And then be yourself. Again, it's a two-way street, right? So the employer is trying to get to know you, so you want to show up. You're showing up with your best self and a professional self, but you still want to be you. And so you want to bring yourself to that interview. Again, try to show that enthusiasm. Super important. Remember, from that interviewer's perspective, they're about to spend a ton of time and energy and money bringing you onto their team. So they want to know that you're actually going to be excited about it. So good questions at the end can demonstrate that. Research throughout your questions can demonstrate that. And then just being straightforward and stating how excited you are can help state that. Maintain proper eye contact. Those well thought out questions at the end, again, can demonstrate enthusiasm. You always want to have some questions prepared. Again, that's something you can put into that portfolio if you bring it, or just have notes by your side for phone or Skype. But you want to have those well thought out questions. And then those questions, make them unique to the employer as well. So we interviewed maybe 30 students last year for a student position, and I would say 25 of them asked, what's a typical day on the job look like? And by the end of those interviews, me and my coworker who were interviewing would kind of just look at each other and wait for the other one to respond. So the more specific you can be, the better. And even we had one student who asked, in the job description, I see that I'll be doing this and this. Can you tell me about some other duties I might do in this position? And just the fact that she incorporated the job description helped her to stick out way more as a candidate. So although our answer didn't change that much, because we were still telling her more about the typical day on the job, it just demonstrated that enthusiasm and showed that she had actually read through that job description. Ask about any next steps in the process, any other questions you have, and then be sure to thank them. And then you can, or we highly recommend you follow up with an email within 24 hours just to thank them and express again your interest in the position. So thoughts or questions on any of those kind of final tips? All right, well, hopefully it all makes sense. Again, those mock interviews will be super helpful. It's always amazing and fun to sit in on mock interviews. When you're the interviewer, you know, it's really easy to be calm and casual. And then as soon as you get into that interviewee role, it gets nerve-wracking again. But know that in that exercise, you learn just as much from being the interviewer as you do being the interviewee. It can be really eye-opening to see how other people are answering questions, what works well and what sticks out. So learn as much as you can, soak that up, and then know that you do have access to Big Interview, which is our online tool for practicing interviewing. You can access it through Mustang Jobs or Handshake on your portal. And what it is, it's video recorded interview questions, and then they ask them, and then you get to record yourself answering a question, which can be a little bit intimidating and awkward, but super, super helpful. So definitely take advantage of that. And then know that you can always make an appointment with me. If you have an interview coming up, we can always talk about how to prepare, and I'm happy to do a mock interview with you for a specific position as well. Drop-ins have changed. They're Monday through Friday, 9 to 11 and 1 to 3, but still virtual drop-ins available as well. And I think that's it. Any final thoughts or questions?
All right, well, thanks very much, Krista. And you can always get in touch with Krista via email, and those drop-in hours are super helpful. So now what we're gonna do is just take a 5-minute break, and we'll come back together at 4:20. All right.
Thanks all.
Thank you very much. Yeah, have a good day. I'm just gonna share my screen with you, and we're gonna go through a couple things related to some tips for doing some research in preparation for the presentation on the research article that you're gonna do in a couple weeks. I'll show you a tool called Mendeley. Some of you have used it before. It's just a way to keep track of references. It's a referencing database. And and then we'll talk about formatting references and citations for articles that you might or reports that you might write for various classes. Okay. Before we get started, do you have any questions? All right. So let's. Can you tell me what you're looking at? I'm sorry.
It's super zoomed in. It just says format.
Yeah, it's kind of blurry.
Okay, let's see. All right, how about now? You see my slides?
Yeah, it's the overview slide.
Uh-huh. Okay, so let's look at that. So, there we go. So how many of you are familiar with journal databases? Yes? Yeah, some of you are. Okay, some of you are maybe just perhaps learning about it. Anyway, journal databases are things that can be used to easily find research articles that are available to you through the library. And as I said, we'll talk about formatting, and we'll talk about a tool called Mendeley. And then if we have time, we'll talk about tips for reading and writing in science. There we go. Okay, so when we talk about writing with style, right? This is kind of supposed to be a joke, and it's hard to read you because I don't see you right now. But I'm not necessarily meaning, you know, like what you look like. Of course, what I'm talking about is when you write, what are the way that tables are formatted in the document? What are the ways that citations are formatted in the document, and what are the ways that references are formatted in the document? And there's a lot of different referencing and writing styles. And what are some of the ones that you might be familiar with, Nicole?
Sorry, did you say my name?
I did.
Some references that I'm familiar with.
Well, just like writing styles or referencing styles.
You know, I don't really have any that like come to like the top of my head.
Okay.
Specifically.
All right. How about you, Max?
I'm having a hard time thinking what you mean by like different writing styles.
Okay. So have you heard of like MLA style?
Yeah, and APA and stuff like that.
And APA, yeah. So that's exactly what I'm talking about. So they're just different ways that when you're writing a document, it's going to follow specific guidelines that are associated with the given style. So that's all I'm talking about.
Okay.
So a common style that we will use in the fields of science and environmental science and management is associated with what's called the Alliance of Crop, Soil, and Environmental Science Societies. And I have a link to this on the Canvas page. And I also have I also have a link to this on a website that I'm going to pull up for you in just a few minutes. But any particular document that you're going to write is going to follow a specific style. And like I said, this is just one of the examples. Okay. And a great tool that you can use to help you follow a given style is called Mendeley. And Mendeley is a referencing database that is personal to you. It keeps your sources in the cloud, and then it also will integrate that information that's in the cloud to a desktop version that's free. And I strongly encourage you to get Mendeley desktop and also create an account for it, a Mendeley web account for it, because it will save you tons of time on the sort of back end of writing a document that has any document that's going to have references in it that has to follow a given style. So let's see here. Camille and Olivia and Josh and Janelle were recently in my environmental soil and water chemistry class, and I had to write some pretty extensive lab reports. So yeah. So Camille, did you use Mendeley?
Oh yeah, all the time.
Okay, and can you share some of your experiences using it, and was it helpful?
For the most part, I would say it was helpful. Sometimes there'd be slight issues, and it could just be with like updating the version of Mendeley. Like it wouldn't transfer the complete like reference style that you needed. But for the most part, actually getting like the journals that you needed and being able to publish those and upload them, most of them you were able to get access to, but if you had to like download a separate PDF, like it just wasn't something that Mendeley had in its program. You had to do a lot of your own fine tuning, but for the most part, it would do a lot of stuff automatically for you, which was really nice. But yeah.
Okay, any of the other people that were in the class have anything to add to that?
I think it's just the best way to stay consistent, and it makes things way easier for you later on. Even if you don't end up using it, like for an article, you still can have it there if you need it again.
Yes. So, like I said, my strong encouragement for you to sort of download a version of it now and just start playing around with it as you begin to collect references. Not necessarily for our class, because I'm not going to ask you to do any extensive research, but for any of the other classes that you're in. Some of the great features of it is, one, it allows you to store PDF files that are associated with any of the articles that you might find useful to you. You can organize those references into certain folders. So if you're working on a particular research paper and for a given class, you can create a folder for that class and populate that folder with any of the articles that you do research on. And it allows you to pick any referencing style that you want, really. MLA, APA, you can pick the one that we use in the Environmental Earth and Soil Sciences major. And you can change them to whatever you want. Now, like Camille said, it's not perfect, but it's pretty close. And a very nice feature of it is that it will link to it will link to Microsoft Word. And so that is to say that as you're writing your paper, you can have Mendeley insert a specific citation into your paper, and then at the very end, you can just basically push a button that says insert bibliography, and it'll go through your whole paper and find all the references that you inserted, and then create a reference list or bibliography with all those articles that you inserted. And it'll do that, like I said, just with a click of a button, and it generally formats them correctly. Okay, so it can save you a lot of time. I encourage you to check it out. All right, so let's talk about databases now. And databases are generally the best tool to find research articles. So last time when we were together, we were talking about primary peer-reviewed research articles, right? And we said a primary research article is one that's presenting brand new information based upon some type of data collection. Peer-reviewed means that before it was published, it was reviewed by an editorial panel, and those editors provided constructive feedback, and they also certified that the way that the data was collected, the way that the experiment was performed, was done in a way that was scientifically rigorous, right, according to the journal or whatever that the article was published in. So today, you all should have a research article, right, and you can kind of take a look at that. And that research article should be something that you're related to a topic that you're interested in, and also should be something that is understandable to you so that you could present it to the rest of the class in a couple weeks. Do any of you have any questions about that? Okay, well, I don't see any questions. So let's see. Here's an example of a primary peer-reviewed research article, right? A primary peer-reviewed research article usually has a couple components that are associated with it. Emma, did you have a question? No. Okay, so usually has a couple components that kind of give it away. Usually it's written in the form of having an abstract, an introduction section, a materials and methods section, a results and discussion, and a conclusion, and then a list of references, right, that were used to back up the research that was performed. So let's see here. Spencer, what do you find in the introduction section of a primary peer-reviewed research article?
What do you mean by introduction?
So in the first section of one of these primary peer-reviewed research articles is going to be the introduction, right?
Yeah, so like the abstract?
Well, the abstract is like, I'm glad you brought that up, but the abstract is sort of a summary of the whole thing. But after the abstract is the introduction section. And what do you typically find in the introduction section?
Probably the general information of like what the location, where the research was done, what the idea was to begin with, on like what research they're actually planning to do.
Yep. So you're going to find some background information related to the research. You might find some site description information. A lot of times that's going to be reserved for the materials and methods, but it's going to provide some context, right, for the information that's going to come next. Okay. And what you typically find at the very end of the introduction section of a research article. And if it's well written, every single, and do you all have your research articles up or close so you can take a look at it? So if you do, and if you don't, pull it up. But if you're looking at it, go to the very end of the introduction section and see what that last paragraph has in it. It's right before the materials and the methods section. All right, Olivia, what do you see?
Objective statement.
Objectives, right? So you should all see something, right, that tells you, and sometimes it'll be very clear, and usually for a well-written one, it'll be very clear. It'll say the objectives of the experiment were to, and it'll list specific things that were done in order to conduct the study. And if you don't see them say the objectives of the experiment were to, they should make it pretty clear, right, what the deliverables were for that experiment. Okay. So it's very critical that you're able to find that, because that's essentially the nuts and bolts of the experiment. That gives you information about everything that's going to be covered next. Okay. Anyone have any questions finding that on their research article? Okay. All right, let's talk about the materials and methods next. So Emily, what do you typically find in the materials and methods?
Can you hear me? My mic hasn't been working.
Yeah, we can hear you.
I usually find the software.
We lost you. All right, Emily must have lost you. Natalie, how about you?
In the methods and materials section, usually just like how they conducted the experiment and like how they did it, just kind of what they used, give you measurements and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly right. So the materials will oftentimes be what the things were that the study was conducted on. It could be a site, it could be specific samples or types of samples that were collected. It could even be, if it's a survey type of research, it'll be a description of the population that was surveyed. And then the methods is how were experiments conducted upon those materials to achieve the results that the authors wanted to achieve. Any questions about that? Okay, let's see. How about in the results and discussion? Caitlin, how about you?
For the results and discussion, they usually go over what they found, they overlay the experiment's conclusions and they relate that back to like their findings and if it was like credible or not and that type of thing.
What do you usually find in the results and discussion? Like what is, and I'm asking this to all of you, how are the results going to be displayed?
Usually in like graphs or tables, and you just kind of enter a little blurb about what it means.
Mm-hmm. So in the results and discussion, what you find is the graphs and the tables, right? So the methods were conducted on some type of materials. The information that was gathered from that then is going to be presented in a table or a figure or some combination of those. Sometimes it's maps, if it's some type of spatial analysis. And not only will the results describe what was found, but in the discussion, what's important and critical and interesting is the so what of what was found. So what's the interpretation of what was found? And what does that mean? And for those of you, right, when you're looking at the paper that you've grabbed, you find a result. So when I'm saying find a result, find a table or find a figure. And then around that table or figure in the results and discussion section, look for some type of discussion. And some of your papers are going to be separated where the results is going to come first, and then there'll be a discussion section next. Some of your papers will have a combination of results and discussion. So in the discussion, what you should find is citations. And so that's where the authors are trying to make sense of their information that they're presenting by citing other researchers who have done something in the field that's somewhat similar. Okay? Can you find something like that in the paper that you have in the results and discussion? And hopefully you can. And if you can't, so let's say that you can't, if you can't find any citations in the discussion section, then there's a good possibility that the article that you have is not a peer-reviewed paper. Because pretty much all peer-reviewed work will have citations in their discussion. Okay. Any questions? Seeing none, let us carry on. So, Siobhan, tell us what you typically find in the conclusion or the summary section.
Usually, I think you'd find like a recap of the objectives and how they met those throughout the experiment.
That's excellent. So what you should find is what Siobhan just said. You should find a restating of the objectives, and then there should be a paragraph or so that's recapping each of the main results. So there'll be, some information about one of the figures that was presented, and that they should go in order that those results were given in the results in the discussion section. So they'll sort of provide a mini recap of what was found and a mini recap of so what, or the implications of that. And then at the very end of the paper, you should see, like at the very end of the conclusion section, you should see sort of a statement about what are the far-reaching implications of the study that was conducted. Okay, so let's see. I'm gonna stop sharing this with you, and I'm gonna show you something else. Okay, so I'm showing you the website for the style guide, or the style guide that we commonly use in environmental science and management. It's the one I was just talking about. But what I want to show you also related to that is, let's see. So I want to show you a good place to access the databases. And before we move forward, I want to ask you what your favorite database is. Liam, what's your favorite database? Can't hear you.
Sorry, I didn't have my microphone on. I use the library database a lot. Like I feel like it's really easy to find a bunch of information there because it's got all the filters. So I usually just use the filters, and that usually helps me find exactly what I need.
Okay. Isabella, how about you? What's your favorite database?
I usually use the library database as well.
Okay. So here we're looking at the libraries or the Cal Poly, your main Cal Poly portal. And so if you're accessing off campus, right, you know to go to the library so you can access all the information in the library using your Cal Poly account. So what I mean by accessing databases, and a very common one that you're probably very familiar with using is Google Scholar, right? That's a very typical database. But Cal Poly has access to some, in my opinion, more powerful and helpful databases. So databases, and you can see this link down here where it says your research and databases. So databases are compilers of research articles in a given field. Okay, so if I click on that, you can see that the databases are organized alphabetically. Some common ones, let's see if you're interested in geology, right? You can click on G, and there's one called GeoRef. It's this one right here. And essentially there's search engines that allow you to very specifically kind of find journal articles, primary peer-reviewed research articles, and some secondary peer-reviewed research articles. I think, in my opinion, the probably most helpful and useful one is this one, and it's the Web of Science. Okay, so this is the one that I would strongly encourage you to use as you're looking for a research article in kind of the environmental science, environmental management field, right? So this is a compiler. You can see it's a search across Web of Science indexes, art and humanities, science citation index, social science citation index, biosis, which is biological sciences, global health, food science and technology, and also environmental science too. So if we go to that one, right, you'll come up with a window that looks like this. And this is where you're going to put in your search terms. Okay. How many of you have used Web of Science before? Yeah, so just a few of you. So if you haven't used it, it is an extremely helpful tool, right, for finding articles that might be of interest to you of the primary peer-reviewed variety. So if you're like me, right, you might be interested in lead and soil contamination of lead. So I'm going to put that as one of my topic terms. I'm going to add another one, and I'm going to put in soil contamination. And I can change that to being in the title if I wanted to by clicking on that drop-down arrow, but I'm just going to leave it the way that it is. And then I know that there is a very well-known researcher named Donald Sparks. And he writes a lot in the soil contamination area. So I am going to change this one to author. And then I'm going to search. right? And so for my results, I've come up with 12 articles, right, that are related to it right up here. And a couple of these first ones relate to some microbial function. This one's biochar. This one looks pretty cool though. The arsenic speciation and availability in orchard soils historically contaminated with lead arsenate. Right, that looks pretty good, doesn't it? For sure. Right, so let's check that one out. Right, and so what pops up is the abstract. And so I could peruse that and see if that looks good to me. And I'm getting more than I had hoped for because I'm also getting some information about arsenic. But let's just say that I wanted to get a PDF version of it, right? So one tool that I can use is this Cal Poly Get It tool. And I'm sure you're all familiar with that. But that will take me to another site, which will allow me to see if Cal Poly has access to a full text version of it. And for a lot of them, Cal Poly does. So there's a couple different ways that I can access it. I'll just try this first one. And here it is right here. So this is the whole article in its entirety. And if I wanted the PDF of it, which I think would be helpful, I can click on that. And there it is, right? And how can I tell if it's a primary peer-reviewed research article? One way I can tell is, does it have the format of a primary peer-reviewed research article? So does it have an abstract? Does it have an introduction section? And though it's not labeled, it is an introduction section. And if I go through the introduction, the thing that I should see at the very end of the introduction section is something related to the objectives. So here's the last paragraph here. And if you read through this, let's see. We haven't, yeah, so it starts right here. The current study assesses speciation, transport, and bioavailability of arsenic, right? So there's the objective statement right there. And then there's materials and methods broken up by headings. And as we get into the results and discussion should be centered around data display, right? Tables, figures here, right? More figures here. And then at the very end of the paper, there should be conclusion, which restates the objectives up here at the beginning of it, and then a long reference list. Okay. Any questions about using the databases? So again, my strong suggestion to you is to use Web of Science is just a good start, right? There's plenty of others out there, but that's probably a good first step. So here's what I'd like you to do for next time. So next time, we're going to talk about how to present these primary peer-reviewed research articles to the class. So find, like I said, you have one already. Make sure that the one that you have is understandable to you, first of all. And if it's not, then find another one, right? And you want to find one that's in a field of interest to you, okay? And what I'm not going to ask you to turn these in, but I'm going to have you present 3 slides to, 3 slides to your group in a breakout group. And here's what these slides are going to be. 1, I want you to have a title slide, okay? So, Janelle, what should be on that title slide?
You should have what you're presenting on, your name.
Yep, and
And
right?
if since it's on like, yeah.
So you could use the same exact title, right? That your research article is, and you should have the names of the authors of the paper, and below that you should have presented by, and that'd be your name, right? Besides the text, though, what should you have? Right, because it's pretty boring just to look at text, right? Justin, what do you think?
Lots of images.
Yeah. So find an image, and it's not going to come from the paper, right? Because the paper is not going to have any color images, right? So find an image from the internet that sort of represents the study, and in a compelling way gives the audience an idea of what the thing is that you're going to be talking about. Okay, so a title slide, an outline slide is the second slide, and the outline slide should just, in bullet points, go through the information that you're going to cover. And so the information that you're typically going to cover is like some background material. You're going to cover, or you're going to list the objectives that you're going to talk about, the materials and methods, results and discussion, and then a summary. And so I'm not telling you to like fill in gaps related to that. I'm just telling you to essentially prepare a table of contents for your presentation. Okay. And then lastly, I want you to prepare an objective slide. So title slide, outline slide, and objective slide. Where do you find the objectives, Jacob?
You would probably find the objectives in just in the abstract, and then as well as in the results.
Almost. Right. You probably find them in the abstract, but where is probably the fail-safe place to find the objectives?
In the intro?
Yeah, and what part of the intro?
Just that last paragraph.
Yeah, so typically last paragraph, right? So you can take those objectives, you don't have to write them out in complete word-for-word sentences, but essentially summarize them, right? And in the paper, if they have 3 objectives, include those 3 objectives, right? And every slide, right? And I'm just kind of giving you some information for what we're going to talk about next time, but every slide that you have should be minimal in text and have images on them, right? Every single slide. All right, any questions about what I'm asking you to prepare for class next time? Yeah, cool.
So just to clarify, is this what we're going to be going over more next time, or you want us to come prepared with these slides already completed before that class?
Thank you for asking that question. So the question that Nicole asked is, do I want you to come to class prepared with these 3 slides? Yes. So you don't need to turn them into me beforehand, but you should come to class prepared with them so that you can share them with the class or with people in a breakout room that you're in. And you should be able to present them as practice to those individuals in your breakout room. Okay.
How are we supposed to present these? Like, can we share screens in Zoom or?
Yep. So from your breakout room, you should be able to share your screen. Okay, and then we'll all just trade off. Okay, any other questions? That's a good one. Thank you for asking it.
What did you want for the outline slide again? Was it like a table of contents?
Basically a table of contents for your presentation. So as you think about putting your presentation together, what are going to be the main components of it?
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. So let me just show you something else here. So here is the Web of Science search result that we found when we were looking up that article. Now, over here, you see where my cursor is? And you see as I'm putting it over here, it's the Mendeley Web Importer. So let me show you this. All right, so here's our main search. So if you put this Mendeley Web Importer, if you put that as an add-in to whatever web browser you use, what that can do is that it can take any of these articles that you might check here, and by just pushing that button there, it can import those into your Mendeley database, which is a really nice feature. Okay, so that's, and like I said, we don't have time really to get into the details of how it works, but as you're doing this class and other classes this quarter, I'd really encourage you to sort of get familiar with it because it's a very helpful tool, like I said. Is there anything else? Do you have questions about anything else? No? Let's see. Let me make sure that I have talked about everything that I wanted to talk about. Okay, I think that we are good. So have a great rest of your week, and I should be getting your resumes and cover letters back to you sometime later this week. And I will talk to you all either in office hours later this week or on Monday. Thank you. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.